Hello, my name is David Jarvis, and bear with me, it's my first video blog. I'm a 48-year-old microbiologist, immunologist, telecom specialist, and I feel compelled to record this video because a number of my dear friends and family are understandably distressed by this virus, COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, which has disrupted our lives now and probably into the future, and are being bombarded by an infodemic of information, which gets passed on to me to try and review at some level, which I've resisted because I am quite busy as a scientist in multiple businesses, trying to work on solutions. But nevertheless, I've realized the importance for my mental well-being and that of my friends and family that I respond in some way. So just by way of background and for credentials, because credentials do matter, in spite of what some popular politicians right now will like to tell you. Just because you're a property expert, it might entitle you to have credentials to look at things like buying Greenland. It doesn't, unfortunately, give you credentials to make decisions, life and death decisions on medical matters. So my background is I'm a microbiologist. I spent 7 years studying at University of Cape Town, molecular biology techniques, microbiology techniques, immunology. I even started a small project while at university to look at managing bioterrorism threats by coming up with a rapid way to build antibody-based antidotes to biological threats. And so my mindset, very much from young student days, has been around how to respond to lifestyle and life-threatening situations that we might face in the future. So besides being a microbiologist and a biochemist, at heart I'm a prepper. My dad was a prepper. He built a nuclear bunker in the basement of his house in the 60s during the Cold War. So that may or may not resonate with some of you who understand the need to prep for scenarios which are difficult to plan for, and certainly difficult to expect that if you depend on the state or on institutions around you, they're unlikely in the case of a severe pandemic, a major incident, whether it be ecological or political or military. It's very difficult for those systems to look after you. And in many ways, you need to stand on your own 2 feet when those things happen. And we're currently in one of those life-changing scenarios where for many people, especially the poor, this is a life-threatening situation beyond the disease. So just in terms of credentials, besides my 7 years of study, I went into telecoms, and hence this video blog trying to link my expertise in telecoms with molecular biology, because I feel that's what's missing with this discussion around the potential influence of 5G networks and a disease like COVID-19. And I started a telecoms business back in 1992, rolled out some quite disruptive networks in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Namibia. These networks got us an audience with people like the UN, who are presented on Wi-Fi for development. We were using Wi-Fi covering cities, towns, to be able to provide low-cost services to residents across all economic categories and all demographics. And at some stage was appointed as a rural broadband expert for the UNDP, just to advise them on some strategy documents. So I have some experience there. That experience as a researcher took us all the way into partnering with a company called Red Pine Signals in India, who were developing a next generation software-based or software-defined radios. We looked at antenna design. I was involved intimately in the RF design of antennas. I've been down to the deepest mines in South Africa. I've been 3 kilometers underground looking at radio propagation underground for communications for miners. I've dealt with security camera networks in the slums of Johannesburg, built on wireless networks. With Red Pine Signals, we're looking at some innovative radio technology, which we're doing ambient energy harvesting, which we're looking at software-defined radio to accommodate things like 802.11n Wi-Fi, LTE, the sort of 4G kind of technologies, and emerging technologies like 5G back then. This was a few years back. So I do have some experience in telecoms, in R&D, in understanding RF propagation, understanding how radios work, how radio waves work. As a microbiologist and a biochemist, I constantly had questions around RF influence on things like causing cancer, etc. And so I've had to deal with those questions over the years, and I think I can honestly say I have engaged with them honestly, with an open mind, and I have used them to both justify some of the networks that we've rolled out and criticize networks that others have rolled out. On the microbiology and biochemistry side, we run laboratories in 4 countries. We have an app development team. We have a clinical trial team that does work in animals. We have a clinical trial team in the USA that we partner with that does work on human in vitro models and also is involved in in vivo trials with humans. We're currently trialing a COVID-19 therapeutic with that company in the States. We have built diagnostics tests for veterinary diseases. We've integrated into our app diagnostics tests for human diseases. We have built a laboratory, partly in response to COVID-19, to fast track some of our work in immunotherapies for veterinary use into use for COVID-19. And so just superficially, some of my background, which I think gives me a little bit of credibility, a little bit, to be able to comment on this issue of 5G and the prevalence of COVID-19. So, as a molecular biologist, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario where a radio frequency network, propagation of radio waves, can induce site-directed mutagenesis, changes in the base pairs of the DNA of a virus, which can make it more or less virulent intentionally. It is, however, quite feasible that radiation in general can increase the rate of mutations. This is how evolution basically works. Copying of DNA is error-prone, and it is accelerated by environmental conditions such as radiation, UV radiation, and others, intense radiation, radioactive decay, etc. So there's some merit in the concept that intense radiation can increase the rate of mutations, which can result in higher prevalence of mutations in wild populations of viruses. However, the attempt to draw correlations between the rollout of 5G technologies, which are using identical wavelengths that have been used for decades, where the only change is the modulation of those wavelengths that allows for more data to be packed into tinier spaces of waves. So more modulation of the wave. You imagine a normal sine wave, what a typical wave looks like. Well, what modulation does, and this is largely where the innovation has happened in moving from 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G, is that within that wave, more and more information is packed. So sometimes it looks a bit like a square wave, okay, where information in that wave is packed. And the density of that packing is what gives you more bits per hertz, right? More data per cycle. And that's really what's changed, not the frequencies. Frequencies are the frequencies. They are the electromagnetic spectrum. They were here long before we existed as a species, and will continue to be here long after we have become extinct as a species. So the probability of a new type of modulation technique with new propagation technologies, with new antennas, causing site-directed mutagenesis such that it can aggravate the viral mutation rate in such a directed way that in multiple locations you can get an emergence of similar disease factors is, quite frankly, preposterous. The fact that secondary issues, hypoxia, that's spoken about as tissue damage in the lungs, can be aggravated by the kind of intensity of radio waves that are being propagated by 5G is also rather far-fetched. And it does, I must contextualize this in that we do live in a world where we are bombarded by a huge plethora of electromagnetic waves that are being used for purposes of transmission in our home, our Wi-Fi, our Bluetooth, our cell phones, the microwave oven, the Internet of Things that connects our fridge to our 3G modem, etc. We are in a milieu of a lot of RF being used for communication. However, we were created in a milieu of a nuclear reactor that is constantly burning a fair distance from us, that drives life on this planet. It's the sun. The sun is the most intense electromagnetic source that you are likely to ever experience in your life. When you stand outside in the sun, when you are sunbathing, you are being exposed to a level of electromagnetic radiation that your body spends a huge amount of effort to protect itself from. And it's able to do so because it's evolved to do so. The DNA has built mechanisms to repair itself when damaged, because it gets damaged often. When you sit in the sun, your DNA is being damaged. Your body has developed ways of building pigment in your skin, right? So that if you live in areas where you're likely to be exposed to more radiation, i.e. the tropics, you end up, over time, developing more pigment. You have a darker skin. And if you choose to live in the latitudes, where half the year it's dark and you stay inside, you end up with a pale skin, right? It's to do with that electromagnetic nuclear reactor that is sitting above us day in, day out, that we need to find ways to protect ourselves against. To compare a Wi-Fi router, a 5G base station, a cell phone tower, to the level of output experienced by walking into the sun is useful. Because unless you put yourself directly in front of a massive telecommunications dish, which is broadcasting at 30 watts or 50 watts, 30 or 50 watts, your Wi-Fi modem broadcasts at 100 milliwatts, right, in your home. The cell phone towers are broadcasting at 10, 15 watts, a fair distance from your home. The radiation reduces with the square of the distance. Every 2 meters that it travels, it reduces by 2 to the 2. The square of the distance is the reduction in the radiation levels. So by the time you're 10 meters away from a base station, the power levels are logarithmically reduced. Nowhere near the kind of power levels you experience walking in the sun. So when people correlate, as I recently had a paper sent to me, the prevalence of COVID-19 cases in 5G, I sigh because correlations are a very slippery slope to try and present as evidence for anything. And without giving you countless examples of how correlations of one thing to another don't have necessarily any causative link, right? The fact that people in high income areas suffer from more obesity, is it because they're earning more? You know, I could make that correlation. The higher the income, the higher the obesity. Is that the reason? Doubtful. I mean, look at the whole butter debate. At some point, butter was bad for you. Why? High levels of cholesterol, right? Cholesterol is what you end up with in your veins when you have hypercholesterolemia, and it's bad because it causes blockages, right? We get that. That correlation that was made was wrong. So be careful with correlations. You know, and when you try and correlate 5G, as some people have done, to outbreaks of COVID-19, understand where network operators roll out 5G. First of all, they roll it out where they're going to get the quickest return on investment. How do you achieve that? You roll it out in areas where you have the highest density of people with the highest levels of disposable income. Why do you do that? Less money spent on infrastructure, more money returned in terms of services sold. It's simple capitalistic economies. It's economics 101. So when you see a correlation between first world countries or more developed countries having recently rolled out 5G and a high prevalence of cases, you can't make the correlation that the rollout of 5G is linked to the COVID-19. Those same societies are highly packed together, are highly mobile, so they're moving around a lot. They travel a lot, so they're bringing infection into that community. And generally speaking, they're testing better, you know? And to somehow link that kind of correlation or prevalence of a high economic activity group to the rollout of 5G, because companies have rolled out 5G, to prevalence of COVID-19 because there are a lot of cases there, is just not sound science. Sorry. If you wanted to go down the route of suggesting that the rollout, sorry, and you must understand that this whole thing of 5G doesn't come out of context. There's a trade war on the go, right? Trump is fighting China around tariffs. China owns the world's leading technologies in 5G, Huawei. The US doesn't. The US is concerned about losing its monopoly on the telecommunication space with the aggressive rollout that China has for 5G. Now, if you take that into context and you look at the machinery that was built into social networks to drive the agenda that brought Trump to power, and you assume that machinery is still in place, and you assume that machinery now has an agenda which is to support this subversion of a Chinese right to power in the telecom space, one has to wonder why there is such a strong social network presence around the evils of 5G, right? So that aside for a second, and all these correlations which really don't mean much. Correlations are correlations. Evidence, however, is based on some very simple, straightforward, widely understood methods. You make an hypothesis. The hypothesis is 5G causes certain conditions in patients. You test the hypothesis by building a protocol together with controls and test groups, whether in animals or in humans or even with cells like tissue culture, and pieces of cancerous material that are grown in the lab to be able to simulate what an organ in the body is experiencing. Expose one to 5G, expose the other to 4G, expose the other to nothing, and compare whether any of these symptoms, effects, correlations that are being suggested in the hypothesis are demonstrable in the lab or in a clinical trial. And some of them are very easy to demonstrate. They don't require a huge amount of time and investment. Clinical trials in the lab can literally happen at a foundational level, building the basic research within a few weeks. It's not difficult. In the absence of that, when people push out information with no correlative, with no data to back up their suggestions, just pointing to correlations that they've drawn out of their cursory readings of the data, it really does not have any credibility whatsoever, even if there is underlying truth in their assumptions. So until you get to a point where someone takes those kind of concepts and does a very rudimentary experimentation, or even just experimental design, which can then be critiqued and then can be taken through some very simple experiment, it doesn't have to cost a lot. You know, you can run these kind of experiments for a few $1,000s. Then you get some data which says, you know what, you guys have got a point. However, from my point of view, as someone who's done R&D in telecoms, I've built RF antennas, I've looked at software-defined radios, I've been intimately involved in rolling out, designing, building, manufacturing, and rolling out low-cost radio communications networks in Africa, who also is a microbiologist and immunologist, who understands at a fundamental level how mutagenesis at a DNA level is happening, how DNA repair is happening, how these kind of viral strains that emerge from zoonotics, from animals, are being are emerging from these pools of viruses that exist in animals, understanding how that happens, being involved in monitoring that space with tools that we have in place to be able to monitor emerging diseases that we've been working on for years. Having that collective of experience and backgrounds and exposure to the research, I can honestly tell you that from a scientific point of view, from my considered scientific point of view, there is no possible merit that I can envisage for a slightly newer technology like 5G having such a profound influence on anything to do with pathology on this scale. None whatsoever. And I really would implore anyone listening to this to, when they're confronted with evidence which is not evidence, with information which is presented in a quasi-evidentiary manner, like I've seen some of these papers, to do some very basic fundamental checks. You know, who is referenced here? Who is the author? What else have they published? Does anyone else concur with their ideas in the scientific community? Is there a political agenda behind this? Like with 5G, a huge political agenda, right? Behind making 5G look evil because at the moment it's a Chinese technology, right? Or Chinese dominated technology. And don't assume for a second that because it's arrived on your desktop through some respected friend or family, that it carries any more merit than the kind of stuff you see on TV all the time coming out the mouths of politicians, right? There is a lot of misinformation. People have got their own hidden agendas for most information that goes out there. I have a hidden agenda. My hidden agenda is I'm tired of being bombarded with this infodemic. I'm working on prophylactic cures for COVID-19, and I spend my time writing this video blog or preparing this video blog, recording it, all right? Because I understand that I have friends and family that really need this issue bedded because they are stressed. So, you know, I have an obligation to them to do something about it. And I need to bed this so I can move on with my work, right? I think we'd all like a therapeutic cure for COVID-19. Yes? No? But I implore my friends and family and those who listen to this to put aside the kind of information like this, which really doesn't serve any constructive purpose for anyone, perhaps behind the intent of the misinformation creators in the beginning, and focus on the things that really matter, right? Right now, what really matters. You know, listen to the advice of those who have studied their whole lives in these fields, people like Dr. Fauci, not the president, who hasn't studied anything about anything other than real estate and finance, from what I see. Take the advice of those people, not because they are your pastor, your rabbi, your imam. No, because they have spent their entire lives working on solutions, understanding the challenges, and have a better chance at figuring out the best way forward, albeit riddled with challenges, because no one's really been in our living memory experiencing something similar to this. So they're going to make mistakes, right? But less likely to make the kind of mistakes that we're going to make on our own, reading infodemic media, or the kind of mistakes that certain leaders, like in Brazil and the US, are making by barging into areas they have zero competency to talk about. Don't be one of them. You know, you have a responsibility to yourselves and to your families to do the responsible thing for their sake. I hope this clarifies some questions. Maybe there'll be another one. For now, this is it. Let me get back to work.